Hi, everyone. Uh, I hope that uh, you all got my email, the message on Google Classroom. I'll just briefly repeat there. Please make sure you're taking care of yourself, taking care of your family. If there's anything at all that I can help you with, please just send me an email and let me know. I can't help with anything if I don't know what's going on. So please communicate. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I figure one of the best things I can do to help you is to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the end of The Great Gatsby. There's going to be a lot that happens here in these last two chapters, and I wish that we could have had these discussions as a class, but I think the second best thing would be to just sort of flip through the chapter and maybe point out some things that I've hit my daily reading goal. That's great. All right. Which is interesting because I have only been on one page. But anyways, as I was saying, as we go through this, I'm just going to point out things that I think are worth your attention, whether it's to put down in your notes, whether it's to highlight a specific quote, or even to just bring out an idea that you might not have thought about before. This is a... So I should talk for a second. What is this? This is not me reading the entire chapter to you out loud. Story time with Mr. Kelly. I want you to read the chapter and then sort of use this as a read along as well, where you can either listen to, I'm going to go through each page and talk about what's important. We can go page by page and you can pause, or you can finish reading on your own and then listen to this afterwards. I'm doing this in one take. I am sitting here with my cat. I don't think there are any children around that will interrupt me, but we'll see. I can hear one yelling in the background, so who knows. Anyways, so let's talk about Chapter 8. What's important here? As we ended Chapter 7, just as a reset here, we had Nick leaving Gatsby, who was waiting outside the Buchanan's house in the bushes just to make sure that nothing happened to Daisy. And so Nick here sees this taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and the two of them have a big discussion here in the early morning of this particular day. And here we see, back in Chapter 6, Nick had mentioned, well, Gatsby told me the real story about himself earlier. And here is where he actually shares that information with Nick, because of this idea of Jay Gatsby had been broken. And then we also hear Gatsby's discussion of falling for Daisy. This idea of being in a place where he really shouldn't have been able to get to, Gatsby says. His uniform covered for the fact that he had no real money of his own. Remember, at this point, Gatsby knew how to seem rich from his time with Dan Cody, but Gatsby didn't actually have any money. This idea of his presence in Daisy's house as a colossal accident. And as he thinks back to this relationship with Daisy, he finds himself, initially there's this idea of Gatsby of just wanting to have a fun diversion and that he would move on. But the opposite sort of happens here. Gatsby finds himself as the one who is unable to move on. And we get a particular line here. Actually, I'll just highlight that one. We get a particular line here of this description of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. And We also have the question here of what does Daisy represent for Gatsby? Here she's connected with this idea of silver, of wealth. For a young man who had grown up so poor, Daisy represents something more to him as well. It's not just personal for him. And that idea of, just being personal. Here on this page, we have another flashback of before he left Daisy for the war. We see what happens down at the bottom of this page about Daisy's letters to him. And eventually on the page after this, we see Daisy moving on. Here we have Daisy's discussion of something within her was crying for a decision. She didn't want to just wait. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately. And as we see in the paragraph below what's highlighted, that shape, that force that shapes her life becomes Tom Buchanan. And when I talked about, Gatsby's love for Daisy not just being personal, but perhaps representing something more, Gatsby actually echoes this idea on the next page here. I skipped one ahead. When he says, in any case, it was just personal. Her love for Tom was just personal, but Gatsby sees his love for Daisy as something much more than that. And on the rest of this page, we have a flashback to when Gatsby returned to Louisville from France, from being overseas, and it's interesting to think about how Fitzgerald uses flashbacks here because, for example, in Chapter 5, when Gatsby and Daisy are reunited, he gives a flashback to when they were together. In Chapter 4, when they first get back together, he gives a very early flashback of the two of them. Here, when Gatsby has seemingly lost Daisy, he gives a flashback to when he had lost Daisy before. As he's wandering around Louisville, as he's taking this train out of the city and reaching his hand out for what he'd lost, in the same way we see him stretching out his hand back in Chapter 1. And so we see Gatsby in the past having lost Daisy. And now we see Nick and Gatsby say goodbye. One thing I might point out here, there's this line from Gatsby, "I've never used that pool all summer." And I'm curious to see, there's different opinions here. Some people look at that as, is Gatsby maybe even just slightly starting to move on from Daisy? If it's something he's never used all summer, well, now is he open to new things? He's been so focused on Daisy, now he's doing something else. Or is that just foreshadowing for what we see happen later in this chapter? And then one quote that I would highlight. One of the last things that Nick says to Gatsby in this scene, other than "I enjoyed breakfast," is this very important line. He says, "They're a rotten crowd. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." And then what happens, Nick's commentary on that is very interesting here. He says, "I disapproved of him," meaning him being Gatsby, "from beginning to end." But as we've read this book, I certainly have not felt like Nick has been disapproving of Gatsby. If anything, it's almost the opposite. And here's where, again, we remind ourselves that what Nick wants us to think is an unreliable narrator. Sometimes we read between the lines a little bit. And so we have this moment here where Nick compliments Gatsby, where Gatsby has his radiant and understanding smile, and then Nick and Gatsby say their goodbye. The next few pages, just like the day for Nick, go by pretty quickly. Nick and Jordan, who had sort of a brusque goodbye at the end of chapter 7. Nick mentions at one point, I couldn't stand to be around them anymore. And Jordan was included in that them. And then here, they're talking to each other. Jordan mentions, you weren't so nice to me last night. And they say they want to see each other below that, but we'll also notice we talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. One of them hung up. Nick says, I don't know which one of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. Nick doesn't want to be around Jordan. He doesn't want to be any of this group that seemingly includes Tom and Daisy and Jordan. And as Nick here is finishing up his workday, we jump in perspective to George Wilson. And we see George Wilson struggling. His friend Michaelis is trying to ask him questions just to try to keep him, conscious, really. Because George is so upset, crying, incoherent muttering as he's talking about the yellow car, mentions that Myrtle was hurt before. And then right after this discussion on the bottom of the page about, have you got a church that you go to sometimes, Wilson, after noting this business here about the dog leash as evidence of Myrtle's affair, also makes the link that, as he keeps saying, oh my God, again and again, Wilson seemingly makes the connection here. Whoever was having the affair with Myrtle must have been the one who killed her. That's why she ran out. And he also mentions here that he has a way of finding out who was driving that yellow car that he mentioned. Now, the most important thing from this scene with Michaelis and George Wilson is down the bottom of this page where Wilson says, I spoke to her. I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window, and I said, God knows what you've been doing. Everything you've been doing, you may fool me, but you can't fool God. And here's where we see, I mentioned the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg as a symbol before. Here's where we see that come back, where Wilson makes the connection, at least for himself, that these eyes are a symbol of God watching what has happened here. And Michaelis tries to tell him, look, that's just an advertisement, but Wilson stares there at the window, staring out at these eyes. And we can also look at the condition of the sign as having been abandoned, with chipped paint, with as being ignored, as this rejection of God, of religion, and morality in the book. Something that Nick mentions back in chapter 1 when he talks about a lack of morality that he sees there. And as we get to the end of this chapter, we're recounting Wilson's steps. He disappears. He disappears for a few hours here. And suppose that he had spent that time going from garage to garage, inquiring for a yellow car. But Wilson says he knows where to find out. Someone, as we see at the top of this page, had given him Gatsby's name. And we'll talk about this more next chapter, but I hope that we have a suspect there based on what we've been reading so far. And then, as the last couple pages here, which I will admit I'm going to shock a few of you here, and it's okay. If you missed this, it is not a bad thing. You shouldn't feel bad. So let's just say it. Let's just get it out there. George Wilson kills Gatsby and then kills himself. Some of you just went, what? I missed that. Well, why did we miss that? It is a little unclear in the book. It's my only critique of the writing of the book. But let's talk about why. We have Gatsby floating in his pool, looking up at this unfamiliar sky, and then we have the shots here from Wilson, the ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the trees. But the real reason why this is so often missed by high school students today, and I'm sorry if I'm the one who's bearing bad news about Gatsby to you, is that this last sentence here, it was after we started with Gatsby toward the house. He could have just said Gatsby's body to clarify there, that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. Now, a Holocaust is... Remember that this book is written in 1922, 23. It's published in 1925, which is 40 years or so before World War II. 15 to 20 years before World War II. And so today, obviously, when we talk about Holocaust, we immediately go to the historical event that happened in World War II. Prior to that, Holocaust was seen as a case where multiple people were killed or slaughtered. And so Fitzgerald would have used that word, and people would have understood immediately. Multiple people have died here. And because the historical event, the Holocaust, has stopped any other real usage of the word, I think that's why there's some confusion today. That's the end of Chapter 8. I'm going to do this again with Chapter 9 to talk about some of the big ideas that are here. Hope you all have a great day, and be well. Please email me if you have any questions.